Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our series looking at the different vehicles in Battlefield 6 and comparing them to War Thunder, this time with the anti-aircraft vehicles. And of course, as a reminder, we do have other vehicles in this series. If you go back to the video looking at the tanks, that is the intro that gives you the basics of how this series is generally going to work. On top of that, all the videos are currently in their own playlist, so feel free to check that out as well. Now, as with every other installment in this series, the first thing we have to do is try to figure out exactly what these vehicles are supposed to be representing in real life. And in terms of the anti-air, they are kind of sort of representing essentially the same vehicle. We have the Cheetah 1A2 and the GE26 pack. And if you want to know what vehicle they're supposed to be representing, all you have to do is translate Cheetah into German and you will get the Gepard 1A2, which is the vehicle in War Thunder we will be comparing them to. Because after all, Gepard is just the German word for cheetah. However, it does get a little more weird. While both of these vehicles have the same hull and essentially the same weapon systems, which means they are essentially analogous to the Gepard 1A2, the Cheetah, which is called the Cheetah 1A2, is actually based on the Gepard, but the GE26 PAX is actually based on a slightly different anti-aircraft system, the PTRL from Dutch origin. There were some individuals saying the Cheetah was based on the PTRL for Dutch because the Dutch PTRL is called the Cheetah. However, the radar dish is actually incorrect. The Gepards use the more traditional dish type radar, whereas the Cheetah, or the PTRL for the Dutch service, actually uses a more bar type radar, and also the tracking radars are a little different as well. So to recap, the Cheetah is actually based on the Gepard, which is German for cheetah, but the GE26 PAX is actually based on the Cheetah, which is called the Cheetah in Dutch service. So the GE26 PAX is the Cheetah, but the Cheetah is not quite the Cheetah, but it is kind of the Cheetah. Clear as mud? Now, the anti-aircraft systems are actually the weakest of all of the armored ground vehicles. Obviously, the light vehicles that have no armor whatsoever and fully expose their crew are weaker. However, these vehicles are considered at least somewhat armored and do have some hit points, but it is noticeably less than both the IFV and especially the main battle tanks. On top of that, unlike basically every other vehicle in the game outside of the fighter jets, the anti-airs only have a single crew member. They do not have any additional crew stations. Now, we're going to go straight into the upgrades, and one big thing that I want to emphasize is the ammunition, because the ammunition very fundamentally changes how this vehicle works in a way that is kind of different than every other vehicle in the game. The first and standard ammo fires in relatively small. They say burst, but it's not actually a burst. You can fire as many or as few rounds as you want from the guns. It just has to reload every handful of rounds. What this means is that if you just sit on the trigger, it will feel like a burst, but it's not actually a burst. While these cannons generally have a higher rate of fire than most of the other armored vehicle main guns in the game, they are still fairly slow firing for an anti-aircraft system. They're less like the Oerlikon 35mm that they're supposed to represent, and more like an older World War II style 40mm Bofors type cannon. On top of that, while the guns do have some explosive mass, it is fairly limited, and for the most part, if you don't want to take an enemy out, you're probably going to have to land multiple direct hits, which, considering that this is a 35mm cannon, is a little ridiculous in my opinion. With that being said, you have two additional ammo types. You have the high velocity ammo and you have the armor piercing ammo. And while it looks like the difference is the muzzle velocity, there are actually a lot of differences between these ammo types. The high velocity ammo does considerably less damage, but also has a much higher rate of fire and a lot more rounds per belt. While the normal rounds have about 12, these have 250. That being said, the individual rounds don't really do that much and you'll still burn through them pretty fast. The armor-piercing rounds, while they do have a lower velocity, it's not that much lower, and the drop is still pretty insubstantial. However, the armor-piercing rounds do have a much lower rate of fire than the standard rounds for some reason. I'm not entirely certain why switching between high-velocity and low-velocity ammo would alter the rate of fire of the cannons. It's a very weird feature in my humble opinion. In exchange for this lower rate of fire and slightly lower velocity, the armor-piercing rounds actually do much more damage against basically all targets. On top of that, the armor-piercing rounds do appear to ignore a good bit more armor than the other two types of ammunition, so if you are hunting armored vehicles, and also to an extent helicopters, they are generally going to do a lot more to that target than the other round types. But this is where we get to one of the most awkward aspects of these anti-air, and that is this targeting reticle, this circle in the middle. Your rounds can go anywhere in that circle, and this is a fairly ridiculous amount of dispersion for an anti-aircraft gun. It's important to remember anti-aircraft guns are expected to engage targets out to several kilometers pretty consistently, and in this case, if you had this much dispersion at as little as 50 or 100 meters, your rounds would be hundreds of meters off target by the time it actually got anywhere near the plane. In reality, an anti-aircraft system with this much dispersion would be a much bigger threat to somebody walking their dog 2 towns over than the actual aircraft they were aiming at. This was also one of the biggest fundamental issues I had with these anti-aircraft systems in terms of trying to hit planes at all. In general, when I first started with them, I thought I just didn't have the lead correct, and obviously I am mostly a War Thunder content creator, so I am used to leading planes and helicopters, many of which go much faster than they do in the game of Battlefield 6. So at first I thought I simply had to get my lead correct, but then I switched to the higher velocity rounds, and because the higher velocity rounds actually have a much higher rate of fire and fire a lot more lead into the air, I could see that I was hitting the target, or at least I was leading the target correctly. It's just the dispersion was causing it to go wildly off target if the enemy wasn't basically on top of me. This also led to a bit of an irony in that an aircraft coming directly at you was often a very difficult target because an aircraft coming directly at you has a very small silhouette and doesn't fill that much of the aiming reticle, so often my rounds would simply be going all around the aircraft as it's bearing down on me instead of actually hitting it. So ultimately, when you're looking at these 3 ammo types, it's really just a question of what do you want. The standard ammo is pretty unremarkable. The high velocity ammo is better at sandblasting hit points off of tanks and helicopters, because even with the crazy dispersion, you're throwing so much lead in the air that you're going to hit something, you're just not doing much damage per hit. The armor piercing rounds are in effect when you've just mostly given up on trying to shoot at any aircraft that isn't a stationary helicopter with your guns and would rather go hunting for ground targets, in which case my experience is that they are generally superior. The anti-aircraft systems also cannot alter 2 aspects of their loadout, and that is the anti-aircraft missiles, which are always lock-on stingers, and the radar system, which is honestly pretty useless. I fought a lot of planes and helicopters and never once saw anything appear on the radar. As far as I can tell, when the radar goes up, that means that it is spotted an aircraft, but that's just guesswork on my part. There's no visual indicator on the screen as to what the radar is actually doing. You do also have an equipment slot with either thermal blocking smoke or emergency repair. And lastly, you have an upgrade slot where you can either do a system upgrade to allow your systems to refresh faster, optimize handling, which increases the overall maneuverability, enhanced loading, which allows you to reload faster, and a targeting jammer, which makes it harder for the enemy to lock onto you. So we've already looked at one major issue with these anti-aircraft systems, and that's that the dispersions on the gun are so ridiculous that your shots can be on point and you'll still land barely if any shots on the target. But there's another issue in terms of the stingers, and that you have to hold the stinger missiles on the target in order to lock on, and it takes a while to do this. On top of that, the base lock range, if you're not being assisted by a target being painted by one of your reconnaissance elements, is only about 300 meters, which means that by the time you actually acquire a lock, the aircraft is basically right on top of you. This doesn't combine well with the fact that every aircraft in the game has flares and will pop those flares as soon as it has you fire a stinger at it, which then gives it some degree of immunity against your missiles, as it will just fly away, and by the time the flare's effect goes away and you have your missiles ready to fire again, the jet will have already gone outside of the range of your missiles. Obviously, none of this engagement process is helped by the fact that the radar is kind of useless right now and doesn't really seem to do anything. Ultimately, after playing quite a bit of anti-air and also some helicopters and planes to get footage for those as well, my conclusion is that this vehicle cannot in a 1v1 destroy any aircraft currently in the game. Basically, every aircraft, if you're trying to solo them, will have plenty of time to back off after they pop their flares and before you get your stingers back up online to simply withdraw. On top of that, most of them can get some pot shots in on you before you actually get a lock with your stingers and fire them, and of course the guns are pretty useless outside of a few hundred meters, so you can't really pursue or pressure somebody that's retreating that well either. So needless to say, if you end up going against pilots that actually know what you're doing, the normal process is going to be they do an attack run on you. You might be able to survive with a combination of smoke and evasive maneuvers. You fire some missiles at them, you fire your guns, you maybe do minor damage, but then they just repair and come back with their flares back intact. There's basically no way to reliably shoot these planes down if they are showing even the smallest amount of awareness. The only way to shoot down planes and helicopters in Battlefield 6 with this anti-aircraft system is either for them to make a pretty careless mistake, or for your team to assist you either with spots, stingers, or both. Certainly if you have some engineers on foot with Stinger missiles, they can definitely bait out the flares, and because the anti-airs can fire 2 Stingers at once, they can actually destroy a plane in a single salvo if the plane sticks around after the engineers baited out their flares. This is made considerably better if you actually have recon marking the aircraft, so you can lock them more reliably at longer ranges and you can lock them faster. And this whole engagement sequence is a 3 or 4 man process just to destroy 1 plane or 1 helicopter. And so if your team is really on point, these vehicles can be effective at destroying planes, but most of the time they're just a nuisance. I've seen somewhere that these anti-airs deny space for aircraft, but that wasn't my experience playing with or against them. The aircraft does the attack runs on the target they want, and they basically have to leave the airspace very shortly anyway to set up for another attack run, and while they're doing it, normally their flares will just naturally reset in that process. Unless flares got a significantly longer cooldown, it doesn't really deny space to those aircraft, as they can still largely do whatever they please. In that respect, the Battlefield 6 anti-aircraft systems are essentially just vultures. They clean up kills from people that aren't paying attention or from enemies that your teammates have already softened up, and that's really all they do. In honor of the word Gepard being the German term for a cheetah, and the Battlefield 6 version literally called a cheetah, I decided to equip this marketplace skin of a cheetah. Now, when I know when Battlefield 6 was first announced and when they were going through the launches, people wanted more grounded skin, so obviously Battlefield 6 would never have a skin like this, because obviously this is not a realistic skin. No real-world Gepard was ever painted up like a cheetah. ... Okay, so there actually is a real-world Gepard painted like a cheetah. It is a slightly different model than this one, and obviously it's not meant for combat, but it is technically historically accurate. As far as the Gepard 1A2 and War Thunder, one of the only real similarities between this vehicle and its contemporaries in Battlefield 6 is that it is pretty frail. It doesn't really have any armor. As I described with the IFVs, sometimes this can mean shells don't generate enough shrapnel to knock out critical components and you can still shoot back, but you can't really rely on it, and generally speaking you should expect if you're getting shot at, you're probably not going to survive. On top of that, the Gepard 1A2, the turret in particular, is pretty weak and at some angles can even be taken out by 50 cals, so it is not really a vehicle that you should try to bait shots with. With that being said, however, this is going to be where the similarities between the Battlefield 6 and War Thunder anti-airs end. Now, the first area is the rate of fire, and I have to do a side-by-side real quick of the Battlefield 6 guns and contrast that with the awesome might of the dual 35mm Oerlikons in War Thunder. So yes, in War Thunder they fire considerably faster, they are considerably more accurate, and also they fire from continuous belts, so you can fire them basically until the barrels melt. With that being said, in most cases you won't need to, because it turns out these guns are incredibly lethal to basically all target types. They will especially shred light vehicles, helicopters, and planes, but they can also do a number even on more heavily armored opponents like main battle tanks, especially if you get them in the side or if you equip the specialized armor-piercing discarding sabot belts. In fact, the 35mm Oerlikons are rather infamous within the War Thunder community for being incredibly efficient at shredding basically everything, often jokingly referred to as an anti-everything gun. Of course, once you move on to the Stinger missiles, the differences don't stop there. The Stinger missiles in War Thunder can basically be fired as soon as they see a heat signature, and if you see these circles on the screen, that means I'm warming up the Seeker, so as soon as I spot a target, I can lock and fire. The Seekers will stay warm for a while once you've started warming them up, so you can just keep them on basically at all times in case you see an aircraft. Additionally, they have what's called an uncaged Seeker, so they have the big circle, which is where the Seeker can potentially look at, and the small circle, which is where it's currently looking at. And you can use this to lock onto aircraft with the small circle and then drag your aim further forward to try and fire the missiles out ahead of a target so they don't have to lead them as much. On top of that, Stingers and War Thunder actually have IR CCMs, missiles, so simply flaring is not enough. You have to use flares in conjunction with cutting afterburner or doing specific evasive maneuvers. If all you do is drop flares and continue flying in a straight line, more often than not these missiles will still hit you. Of course, both of those are augmented by the radar set. The radar set can scan out to about 20 or 30 kilometers depending on what setting you specifically have. You can lock onto targets, and once you have locked onto a target and it is within range, it will actually give you a lead indicator for your gun showing roughly where you need to shoot to hit the target. The lead indicator is not 100% accurate simply because obviously there is some variance, and if the plane is actively maneuvering, obviously in that case where you need to shoot will be changing rather considerably. But within about 1 to 2 kilometers, this radar computation does make the guns exceptionally accurate and deadly. On top of that, the Stingers have a notional range of around 4 to 6 kilometers. It kind of depends on the target and how big the heat signature is, and of course things like time of day and all that stuff. Of course, I imagine Battlefield players are hearing ranges such as 20 kilometers and 4 to 6 kilometers and just absolutely having their minds blown at how far away you can hit aircraft from. And while it does seem pretty far, once we start getting into the aircraft and some of the ranges on their munitions, you'll realize this actually isn't that much in the grand scheme of things. The Gepard 1A2, despite its visual similarities, in practice has very little in common with the anti-aircraft systems in Battlefield 6. It is considerably more effective against ground targets, considerably more effective against air targets, and generally just a terrifying vehicle to fight all around. These are some of the most infamous types of vehicles in the game, which is these anti-aircraft systems with the dual Oerlikons, and augmenting that with some Stingers does give it some added flexibility, especially against things like helicopters or planes. The best analogy in my opinion for Battlefield 6 would actually be the support class, and anybody who's played Battlefield 6 knows that despite the name support class sounding like they stay in the back, they actually don't. They have light machine guns, and additionally they also have basically infinite ammo with their ammo restocks. The support class in Battlefield 6 are actually incredibly good at simply assaulting positions and taking out enemies on their own without really much of a need for a team, unless you run into things that are so heavily armored that you can't quite deal with them yourself, in which case you have to call on the engineers. And the Gepard 1A2 very much serves that role. At the surface you see it as an anti-air and think, oh, it's good against planes, but in practice it's good against basically everything outside of the most heavily armored targets in the entire game. And that wraps up our video. What do you think of the anti-aircraft systems in Battlefield 6 and how they compare to their counterparts in War Thunder? Do you think the anti-aircraft systems are as useless as I do? Feel free to let me know in the comments down below. I always love to hear from you guys. If you liked the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.